Hi guys, my name is Doug, a member of the technical service group here at Task Force Tips. And in this service video, I'm going to show you how to do a rebuild on a ball style valve, specifically the ball style that uses a polymer ball. Some of you may have seen another video we did that is a stainless steel valve rebuild. That's a different process. This is specific to kind of what we consider the H-VO valve. You'll find this style ball valve in quite a few of our different handheld nozzles and valves. I've got a small array of them here. This may not be everything, but you will find them in the flip tip of various varieties, in the Metro 2, as well as our VIT series nozzles, valve integral tips. This process will be the same for each of these valves. On the next slide, I'm going to show you all the parts and pieces and tools you need to complete that service. Once you gather those up, we'll meet back here. We'll get the service started. Okay, so we're back at the bench. The first thing we're going to need to do to start the service is we're going to need to remove the outlet from the valve assembly. Now in this case it's an 1.5" threaded male, simple ball valve. In the case of some of the other nozzles, the Metro nozzle or some form, they're all going to have the same set of set screws here that retain the fitting into the valve. So although the valve may look different overall than what you're working on, the retention method is going to be the same. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove these two set screws using a 3/32 Allen wrench. And you can set those aside. Those will most typically have some thread patch on them or some blue Loctite to retain them. We'll set those aside where they won't be lost because they are small. Now the next thing we need to do is to remove the outlet. Now just a word of caution, especially with the exposed threaded male threads, don't just grab them with your hand and try to unthread it because the threads are sharp. It will potentially cut you. So a couple methods to removing this. The simplest is just with some channel locks and a shop rag to help protect the threads so that you're not causing damage to the threads or as minimal damage as possible when you unthread those. So just put a shop rag on there, unthread that. Now that is sealed by an O-ring, so there will be resistance initially when unthreading that. Get that started to a point where again you can grab it with a shop rag. Go ahead and unthread that. Now if you find you're going to be doing more of these or you're concerned about damaging the threads, a simple tool that we turn out sometimes that you can do in your shop as well is if you have an old female coupling. This is just a female coupling that wasn't being used. You have one in a bandsaw or something, cut a slot in the coupling. What that'll do is that'll give you a service clamp so that you can thread this onto the threads and then place this coupling in a vise so that it grips and closes that gap. That will tighten down on the male fitting and that'll hold that rigid while you unthread the valve from the fitting. What that does is it prevents any chance of you cutting your hands removing it. It also is the best method for protecting the threads when you remove those. So once we've got the outlet out, you'll see at the front, here's the front seat. The front and the rear seat in these valves are exactly the same and it just sits in there. So you can go ahead and just pull that out and set it aside. The assumption is if you're doing the service work, you'll be putting a new one in. At the front of the valve, you'll see that O-ring I was referring to that seals to the front, the outlet fitting, whatever that may be. Go ahead and remove that O-ring. That can be replaced as well. Now that gets us into the point where we can remove the ball. You want to have the ball in the closed position, handle forward, in the off position. And then from the back end, just from the inlet, you can generally just put your thumb in there and push the valve or push the ball straight out. It just rides on two grooves that engage the trunnions. And then in the back you'll see there's the rear seat, again exactly the same as the front, just in the back. We'll need to finagle that out. Open that valve handle, get your pick underneath there and start it, and then open the valve handle, or I'm sorry, close the valve handle to allow that to come the rest of the way out. Now this takes us to a point, if you were just doing a very simple valve rebuild, in which case you were just putting in new seats and a ball and an outlet O-ring, this is as far as you would go in the disassembly. At this point you'd want to make sure you wipe out any debris that may be in the valve. Make sure we're putting new parts back into a clean valve. So that would be as far as you go for a simple rebuild. Now we're going to go just a step further. I'm going to show you how to do a complete rebuild, in which case we replace the O-rings and the little shims behind the trunnions on the handle, which requires the disassembly of the handle as well. So to do that, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the two button head screws that hold the handle, the bail handle, in place. This requires a 7/32 Allen wrench, and these are retained with red Loctite, so the initial breaking free of those screws may be a bit difficult, but they will come. Take those parts out, set them aside, we'll reuse those. Okay, so on either side there's a little aluminum cup that engages a roll pin in the trunnion that actually drives the valve open and closed. So those should just knock out. There's no threads, they just sit in place, and the screw head holds those in from falling out. Okay. Now the next step, in order to get the handle off, you can see the roll pin is still positioned in the handle. We need to get the trunnions or the valve discs out of the valve body itself. And you can generally just knock them into the inside of the valve body by using your Allen wrench and just pressing on that roll pin. They'll fall in. Same on the other side. There should be a Teflon shim on both sides. You can see that one come out. The Teflon shim and an O-ring. You just use your seal pick to get those the rest of the way out. Now that O-ring that came out, that's what seals the valve disc to the inside of the valve body. So if you're doing a rebuild because it's leaking through the ball, or if you have water spraying out the side of the valve or leaking out the side of the valve, that's an indicator that these O-rings need to be replaced, so you'll be doing a more complete rebuild than just the seat and ball. Now the next step here, this is where you want to use a little bit of care. Don't just grab the handle and pull it off, because there are two spring-loaded balls in here. That's what creates the detent feel of the valve. So you want to capture those so they don't go flying. The best way is to put your fingers underneath the handle, place your thumbs over both cups where those balls are at, and as you pull up on the handle, move your thumbs down over those balls to capture them. Just like that, so we've got them captured where you can release them, as opposed to looking for them underneath your workbench when you pull the handle off. Set those aside as well as the handle. So that's a complete teardown at this point, where we would start the reassembly of a complete rebuild. Okay, so to start the reassembly, once we've got it to this point, we're going to go ahead and put the handle back on. Now the handle can go on either direction, but only one way is correct. So if you look, this is the outlet, here's the inlet side of the valve, here's the outlet. So when you're putting the handle on, there's two holes in the handle. This central one is the rotation point that the screw goes through to hold it on. You can see the other hole in this point is up and forward of that. That should be facing, that upper hole should be towards the outlet of the valve. Okay, so central point, up and forward, facing towards the outlet of the valve. It will go on this way, but this direction is incorrect. The ball valve will not open all the way. Okay, so keep that in mind when you're putting your handle on. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to put the springs into each pocket. They just sit in there. We're going to position the valve to accept the handle. Just lay it on the table like that. Kind of the opposite of the disassembly. Put a ball in each cup. Retain it with your thumbs. Just like this. We've got both balls captured in there. And we're just going to press it down over the valve body. And that will capture those balls. Okay. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to prepare the valve discs for installation into the valve. We'll get our new parts. We'll put these aside. So here we have our new parts. We have 2 Teflon shims and 2 O-rings. The purpose of the Teflon shims is to separate the 2 hard coat aluminum surfaces from each other. Here's the hard coat valve disc and of course the hard coat body. You don't want those 2 surfaces rubbing together because they'll gall and bind. So we put a Teflon shim in between there. It's not a seal of any sort, it's just a separator or a slippery surface for the 2 pieces. Okay, so that goes on. We'll put a little bit of grease around there for the O-ring, or you can grease the O-ring ahead of time. We'll put the O-ring on. That's what makes that watertight seal between the valve body and the valve disc. And again, we'll go ahead and put a little bit of grease over the O-ring itself. We'll do that to both discs. If you grease the O-ring ahead of time, you'll get 360 degrees of grease on the O-ring. If you do it this method, then you want to grease the part, put the O-ring on, and then grease over the O-ring. That way we get grease all the way around the O-ring for installation. Doesn't take a lot. Okay, so now in this case of these valve discs, if you look at those, you'll notice there's an L and an R, or an R and an L, standing for left and right. Now, typically when we talk about left and right, we're talking about from the operator's position, how you would be operating a unit as you stand in the normal operating position. However, in this case, if we were using it in this manner, this would be left, this would be right. However, these L and these R's were put here for the installer's reference. So when we put these in, the outlet, the left, obviously the left side of the valve, the right on the right side of the valve. Now if you're working on an older valve, that L and the R probably are not there. So when you put these in, you can see how the hole sits to one side. When you put that on the left side or on the right side, that hole should be on the bottom side of the valve. So what we'll do is we'll put those in, and what we're trying to do is we're getting that roll pin through that upper hole. You have to give it a little push to get that O-ring to engage. Once you get everything lined up, push that in. Then we're going to do one side at a time, as not to knock that back out. We'll go ahead and we'll put the cup on. Position that over the roll pin. And then we'll take one of our button head screws using the 7/32 Allen wrench. We'll put some red Loctite on there. Just a bead all the way around. And then we'll thread that into the valve disc. Do it kind of gingerly at first until you just engage the threads. You don't just want to push the screw in and take the chance of pushing that valve disc back out. And hold it in with your other hand while you tighten this. And then just go ahead and snug that up. You can see here how the screw head just overlaps that cup to hold that cup into place. We'll do the same thing on the other side. The one marked R. We'll get that roll pin lined up with the handle hole. And get that to snap into place. And the same thing, just go ahead and snug up that screw. That will hold everything in place. Okay, so that'll get the handle and the valve discs back in place for a complete rebuild. The first thing we want to do is we want to have the handle in the closed position. That'll position the valve discs so that we can put the rear seat in. We'll get our new rear seats. As I mentioned earlier, the front and the rear are exactly the same. However, one side is flat, the other side is concave to match that ball, the surface that is riding on. So to put the back disc in this case where the valve discs are in there, you want the concave, if this is the top of the valve, you want the concave facing the bottom of the valve. You'll simply insert it on top of the valve discs and open the handle. It'll fall directly into place where you need it. At this point, we'll close the handle again to position it to accept the ball. Now, something to point out, two different balls. The current ball is a full round ball, and you'll see a very tiny groove machined in the ball here. That groove is to accept a retaining clip in installations where there is a smooth bore inserted inside the valve or inside the ball. Previous models had this notched ball. I point this out just so that we can show you both cases if you're rebuilding an old one or possibly putting new parts in, getting both in the correct way. Okay, so when we're looking at the old valve ball, you'll notice there's a notch in it. If you're reusing that ball and putting that back in, when you install that into the valve, you want that notch to be facing towards the inlet and on top of the valve. So it would go in this manner. Valve handle closed. Just push that down over the valve discs. And what you'll see if that's installed correctly, kind of difficult to see way up in here, but in the handle being closed, that notch, you should see that gap at the top of the valve. We're going to go ahead and put the new ball in. In this case, as we talked about, you have this little machined groove in here. Now, whether or not you're using the retaining ring and the smooth bore inserts, we want to make sure that's installed in the correct position so that if you ever do install one, it's where it needs to be. So when this ball is open, that groove should face the outlet of the valve, the exit side of the valve. So to ensure that's correct when you install it, valve handle closed, that groove should be facing down towards the bottom of the valve, so that when you pivot it open, it's facing towards the outlet. So facing down towards the bottom of the valve, push it down over the valve discs until it seats all the way in the back. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to put a little bit of grease up here where that outlet O-ring goes. And we'll put the new O-ring in. It sits down in just a tiny little groove right behind the female threads in the valve body. Make sure that's tucked all the way in there. And then a little bit of grease, again, over that O-ring. Now on the outlet, it used to be that the outlet threads were just that. They were just threads. and you would tighten down the set screw on the threads to lock that outlet into the valve. Now all the fittings that go in will have these little machine grooves. Instead of placing the set screw into the threads, we're just placing it into these grooves to lock it into place. We'll go ahead and we'll put a new outlet in. This happens to be, this outlet is just an 1.5" male thread, a standard ball valve. This is one that is designed to accept a smooth bore insert, a lot like that ball is. So you'll see a groove here, and it's got a little bit of extra length. But regardless of the piece you're putting in there, you're going to see these machined notches to accept the set screw, and the install will be the same regardless. So the first thing, put a little bit of grease in the outlet here. This is just acting as a temporary adhesive to hold that valve seat in while we install it. Again, keep in mind the direction it goes in. We have a flat side and a concave side. Flat side goes into the fitting, so that the concave mates against the ball. Now what we're going to do is we're going to start that, get it past the O-ring, and just start threading it in. If you have an outlet that you can't get a good handhold on without grabbing the threads, then again, go back to the method of using the shop rag and the channel locks or the tool that you may have made to put that in. You want to go till you feel that seat against the ball. Operate the valve back and forth a little bit and see how the tension feels. It is possible you can over tighten this, just like that, and if you do, you'll feel it catch. The opening in the ball will catch the seat, and you'll have to give it an extra pull to get it to open. That means it's too tight. So back that off. You want to go till it just kind of touches. Put a little bit extra on it. And in the case with the notches, what we're going to look right now in the thread hole, all we see are threads. We want to back that up just a little bit until you find the first notch you come to where there's no threads in it, so that we're putting the set screw into that hole. Make sure that all still feels good, and then we'll reinstall the 2 set screws that retain that in place. Now for these, this is blue Loctite. It's a small screw, so it doesn't take a lot. Go ahead and thread that in till you just feel it touch the outlet. There, it just touched and stopped. Wipe off that excess. Same thing on the other side. Go in till you just feel it touch. There's no need to tighten it up. If you put one side in and tighten it too hard, you can push the outlet off center, which can reduce the compression on one side, which could create a leak. So you just want to evenly, till they just touch and stop. It's in that notch, so it cannot back out. That completes the simple rebuild of the ball valve. That then completes the complete rebuild, including valve discs of the ball valve. If after having reviewed this service video you find you have additional questions or concerns, certainly feel free to reach out to us. You can find all of our contact information at tft.com, or you can also reach us at 800-348-2686 and ask for the technical service group.